Hello again, everybody. I just want to do a little mini lecture before you start your readings on Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. So it might seem like a whole lot, and I'm sorry, but we've got to kind of crunch things up here the remainder of the semester. And you'll notice you've got a couple of chapters for the next 2 weeks to read each week, and then it goes down to one, okay, to try and make the back end of this a little bit easier. So 5 and 6. Both these chapters are covering leading to the American Revolution and talking about the American Revolution. So I want you to do some thinking as you read through it. What do I want you to get out of this? So both of these chapters are covering what leads us to the American Revolution and the course of the American Revolution. So the first thing that's leading us to the American Revolution, we have to look back at Great Britain. And remember, Great Britain had salutary neglect. And that was a policy towards the Americans, the American colonists, because they were busy in wars with France and European wars. So they let us kind of evolve on our own. There was no representation of each of the colonies within Parliament, and we were just doing our thing. Then, the French were doing their thing. Now remember, the Great Britain was a mortal enemy to the French, and vice versa. So the French are up in Canada, and they're in the fur trade, and they're coming down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans with their furs and their trade items. And there are forts along the way down the Mississippi that these traders can dock to and have a meal, and it's like little trading centers. So before they get to the port of New Orleans. Well, the governor of Virginia thought, I think these French are encroaching on British land. So we're all cool and groovy about not really being overseen by Britain, but the governor of Virginia is like, hey, if I can take over some of this French land, we're going to look great. But in doing so, he really basically starts what becomes the American Revolution, because he creates this skirmish. He creates a fight that didn't really exist. And why do we know it didn't exist? Because after the 7 Years' War, we didn't gain any new territory. So we fought for nothing, really. And then it led to independence. So, who's to say at this point whether we would have been better off not having the 7 Years' War? I mean, I don't know if independence would have been a byproduct naturally or what, but at this moment in time, in the 1750s, through the speculation of these Virginia folks who are George Washington's half-brothers, by the way, and George Washington was in the 7 Years' War. He was a colonel in the 7 Years' War. The governor of Virginia contacts Great Britain and says, hey, bring your soldiers here to the colonies because we want to fight the French over here. Well, this then begins the 7 Years' War. Now, sometimes they call the French Indian War, but reality is that the Native Americans, the Algonquin speakers who had good relations with the French, and the Iroquoian speakers who had good relationships with the British, they really weren't involved in the very beginning because they were hoping that the French and the British would, kill each other off and then they'd have their land back. It wasn't until towards the end of the war that they really said, oh, the British are going to win, we're going to side with the British. However, that's what brings the British over to the Americas, and it reignites this thinking from the Great Britain and Parliament. Oh yeah, we got these colonies over there. That's right. So when the war is over, and it's really basically a world war, when the war is over, naturally Great Britain needs to put money back in its coffers because war costs money. Well, what they did not only here in the Americas, but they also did in Great Britain and all of the countries that were under the United Kingdom, and that is that they started to tax people. But because we didn't have representatives from the colonies in Parliament, we were angry because people who felt very independent of Great Britain before now felt beset upon. Why is Great Britain taxing us? They were taxing us because they had every right to tax us, and every single tax was repealed. So one thing to begin with here that I want you to think about is that the Revolutionary War and what leads us to independence wasn't all the taxing. It was really the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War cost money, and Great Britain naturally wanted to get their coffers filled back up again with money, meaning their banks. They needed to regain some of that money. That's what coffers are. They're a bank, basically. They needed to refill their banks with money for the expense of the war, and therefore they were taxing us. Well, we fought against them. We rebelled against it in many different ways. Women as well as men boycotted. There was a lot of ways that we rebelled against these taxes, not just the Boston Tea Party. Some of the rebellions began through groups that, and some were called Regulators, and also there was the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were craftsmen and artisans, and they started in Massachusetts, in Boston, and New York. Boston was called the Loyal Nine, but the Sons of Liberty ended up being in every one of the 13 colonies. Very important thing. Regulators, very much a part of the 13 colonies. And the Regulators ended up being the voices of justice in those regions, in the colonies. And there were different regulator groups, depending on if it was a backcountry North Carolina or the eastern shore of North Carolina. So there were regional men who were on guard keeping the law. Now, of course, were there issues? Oh, yes, because if you have the law in your hands, that means you have power. And so if you wanted to misuse that power, you did, okay? And there was nobody to stop you. So that led to chaos in a lot of places in the backcountry. Still, because we rebelled, the question started to come up, are we really independent, virtually independent, or are we still British citizens, British subjects? Where are we really? Because we've been alone for so long, we see ourselves as being independent. We've formed these colonies. We have a good economic base. We identify as Massachusetts men or North Carolinians or South Carolinians, not as Americans. We identify ourselves as what state we're from. So that's a big deal. So now the Continental Congress gets together and they begin to ask the questions. Who are we? Are we British citizens? They don't really want to immediately disengage from Great Britain because there's a couple things. First of all, as a British citizen, even though you're a subject and you have to do what the king says, you're a citizen, therefore you have some rights. They have the Bill of Rights they created in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution there said, hey, we can govern ourselves, and here we have a parliament. Members of parliament represent the people. Was it flawed? Oh, yes. Anytime you have people in power, and a social hierarchy, of course, is going to be flawed. Still, over here in the States, we're seeing ourselves not as Americans like United States, we're seeing ourselves as people who belong to a particular state. And now we have to reevaluate who are we with regards to our relationship with Great Britain. So the men of the Continental Congress, they come together. The Continental Congress is not a legal Congress that is sanctioned by Great Britain. So these are men who are kind of being treasonous to Great Britain, but they're coming together to decide who are we, what's our relationship with Great Britain. And most of these guys, they do not want to be separate from Great Britain. But they want to renegotiate their relationship with Great Britain. So they send out an olive branch petition to the king. And while that is out to the king, remember, this is not happening overnight. It takes about 8 months to get the petition back, because it's taken about 3 months to get over there. It has to get to the king. He has to make a decision, and then it has to come back over on ships. So it's a long period of time. And he comes back, and everyone in the meantime is arguing over what's our relationship with Great Britain. Do we want to be separate? Do we want to be together? And during that time, we have issues with Lexington and Concord, not here in North Carolina, but in Massachusetts, with British troops. We have the Boston Massacre, which was a whole hullabaloo too. And and I want to reinforce the Boston Massacre, the Stamp Act, none of these things directly, it wasn't one thing alone that tipped us towards independence. There's a lot of things that were going on at this time. And not everybody wanted to be separate from Great Britain, because you must remember they have the strongest army and navy in the planet, on the globe. Do we really want to, we don't even have an army. We have no militias. We have just these local people how are we going to fight the greatest army in the world? So this is a huge deal. Think about it yourself. Think, if you can, I know we're Americans and we have the strongest army in the world, but it doesn't mean we're undefeatable. We think we might be undefeatable, but look at the war in Iraq. It's lasted 20 years. If we were so high and mighty and great, why would it take so long? Well, partially because there's a lot of things going on, and it's just not about might and strength. It's about a lot more stuff than that. So while they're trying to figure out, while the Continental Congress is trying to figure out what to do, Great Britain is getting into skirmishes in Concord and Lexington and Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill and all these things. And these are small battles in Massachusetts between the Massachusetts militia and Great Britain, and the Continental Congress is trying to figure out what to do. They do create a Continental Army because of those skirmishes, and Washington becomes the general of them. But still, they don't know what to do until they hear back from the king. And the king's petition comes back, and that's really what unites them together, because the petition comes back and says, oh, you're all a bunch of traitors. You're all going to hang. And so you have 13 different colonies, 13 different viewpoints, and everybody's arguing, and now suddenly they're all in this together because they're all gonna hang if they continue the way they're doing. So it basically, that petition really seals the deal about independence, and so they declare independence. And I encourage you to read the Declaration of Independence. It is very, very well worded. And thus starts the American Revolution. Now, of course, we get into the American Revolution. We're fighting against the strongest army and navy in the world. And not everybody's down for this because, we're just a ragtag group of people. And we're not a formally trained army. They're a professional army. We're not. So as you read in chapter 6, the biggest issues here going forward is, number one, Great Britain, the British government still sees us as British citizens, and so their way of fighting with us is really to put down the rebels. It's not to squash us. And so their heart is not like, I want to kill everybody. They're like, let's just get rid of the problem and we'll go back to the way we were. The Americans are like, oh, whoa, we're in this. We're full tilt boogie. We're in this fight, and we're going to cut off your supply lines, and we're really in this. And Great Britain doesn't realize that to the end. The other thing that happens is that there are two huge morale boosters and that really help us along. And one is the battle at Trenton. Now, the Battle of Trenton is where you see Washington going over the Delaware River in the middle of the night. It's Christmas Eve. In Trenton, there were German mercenaries called Hessians, and it's Christmas Eve, so they're partying, they're drinking, cavorting around, and they're wasted, they're drunk and wasted, and Christmas morning, they're attacked by the Americans. So that's a big deal. We needed that morale booster. Of course we win, because they're all wasted and they're laying around, and over the course of that frigid night, the Americans are crossing the Delaware River over into Trenton, and we get them. The next thing that happens is the battle at Saratoga. Battle at Saratoga lasts a couple of days, but in the end, it is the real turning moment in the war, because us winning brings the French into it. And that's where we have the French Navy at Yorktown at the very end. The French Navy and the American Army has Great Britain surrounded, and Great Britain, surrenders. So now what do we do? How do we move forward? And that is for next week's discussion board. How do we move forward? So I want you to think about this. Do you think everyone is going to be in America on board with this? This war, this Declaration of Independence? Why wouldn't they be? So underneath this video is your question. I want you to think about it. Do not use Quizlet. Do not copy and paste. It goes from your brain. You're thinking about all this. And then it goes either through your mouth to your hands or directly to your hands in typing what the answer is going to be. I do not accept, oh, I like your idea. I like your answer. Oh, I agree with you. Nuh-uh. Substantive. It has to, this is a dialogue. We can't be in class having a discussion. We're doing this on a discussion board, okay? Remember to look at your syllabus to know the expectations for how to earn all 50 points, okay? All right, guys, that's it for this mini lecture. I hope it was interesting, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.